Imagine you are standing at a gate. Not just any gate. A gate that tells you everything about the man who built it and everything about the world that built him. The wood is lacquered deep red. Bronze animal heads grip the hinges. The platform beneath your feet rises 3 full body lengths above the street, which means you have already climbed before you have entered. You are not simply walking through a door. You are performing an act of submission to architecture, to power, to a civilization so old it has forgotten it was ever young. This was the entrance to a royal palace of the Warring States period, and almost no one alive today knows what it looked like inside. Most people, when they picture ancient Chinese palaces, see what came later. The symmetrical grandeur of the Ming and Qing dynasties, the red walls of the Forbidden City in Beijing, the golden rooftops that have become the image of imperial China around the world. But that world was built nearly 2,000 years after the world we are entering today. Before China was a single empire, before there was one emperor and one capital and one set of rules, there were at least 7 separate kingdoms, each with its own palace, its own rituals, its own architecture, and its own idea of what power was supposed to look like. Those palaces are gone now. Most of them were burned. Some collapsed slowly into the earth. What remains are mounds of packed clay, a few tile fragments, and the written accounts of people who walked those halls while they were still standing. This is what they saw. The first thing you need to understand about the palaces of the Warring States is that the word palace, in the way most people understand it, is almost too small for what was actually built. These were not simply large buildings. They were cities within cities, self-contained worlds where the king lived, governed, received envoys, performed the rituals that kept the cosmos in order, and was buried when he died. In the state of Zhao, in the city of Handan, which still exists today in southern Hebei province, the ruins of the royal palace complex stretch across nearly 2 square kilometers of land. Archaeologists working that site have found evidence of the Zhao court's presence from 386 BCE onward, when the Zhao kings moved their capital south and began constructing the most ambitious building project in the northern plains. The rammed earth foundations that survive today still rise above the surrounding fields like small hills. They are the bones of something that once had skin, color, sound, and smell, and the weight of understanding that requires a particular kind of imagination. In every kingdom, the royal compound was built on a tai, a raised earthen platform engineered from layers of compacted soil stamped down by hundreds of workers over years or decades. This was not a stylistic choice. It was a statement about the nature of the king himself. The higher the platform, the closer to heaven. The more labor required to build it, the greater the demonstration that the kingdom could afford to redirect human effort away from farming and toward spectacle. One palace platform in the state of Wei was so legendarily tall that it was called the platform that reaches halfway to heaven. A minister reportedly had to remind the king of Wei that building such a structure would require conquering all neighboring states simply to obtain enough land for the foundations. This is the kind of conversation that happened in palaces, where the boundary between ambition and absurdity was genuinely unclear, and where no one around the king was entirely certain where the limit was. At the capital city of Yan, the remote northern kingdom, excavations near modern Yixian in Hebei province have revealed a palace mound still standing 20 meters above the surrounding ground. The archaeologists who measured it noted that 2,000 years of erosion had already stripped away a significant portion of the original height. When it was standing in full, topped with its wooden pavilions and painted galleries, it would have been visible from an enormous distance across the flat northern plain, which was, of course, exactly the point. A palace you could see from far away was a palace that projected power before any ambassador or general had even reached the city gate. What most people have never imagined is that these raised platforms were themselves just the foundations of a far more complex vertical world. Against the face of the packed earth tai, architects built terraced wooden halls that climbed the slope in stages. each level connected to the next by covered walkways and open galleries. The effect was something between a mountain and a building, a structure that used the earth itself as part of its architecture, so that walking through the palace was also a kind of ascent. The further in you went, the higher you climbed. And the higher you climbed, the more restricted the space became. This was deliberate. It meant that access to the king was not just a social phenomenon, but a physical one. You did not simply need permission to approach the ruler. You needed legs capable of the climb, and guards who would allow you to continue, and the right ritual posture for each successive threshold. The state of Qi provides one of the best documented examples of what a thriving warring state's palace world looked like from the outside. Linzi, the capital of Qi in what is now Linzi District, Zibo, Shandong Province, was by most accounts one of the largest cities in the ancient world. Contemporary observers described streets so crowded that the wheels of carriages bumped into one another and pedestrians rubbed shoulders continuously. The city reportedly contained 70,000 households. In its southwestern corner, enclosed within a smaller walled precinct inside the larger city wall, lay the royal palace complex of the Qi kings. This inner enclosure, the palace city within the outer city, was the heart of an entire civilization's administrative and ritual life. Excavations at the Linzi site have revealed the foundations of at least 10 major palace structures, distributed across the compound according to a spatial logic that determined which activities happened where, who could enter which zones, and what rituals were required at each boundary. But the buildings themselves have not survived. What survives is largely negative space, the outlines of walls in the earth, the drainage channels cut to carry water away from the halls, the tile fragments that tell archaeologists where the roofs once were. In the case of Linzi, the palace tiles that have been recovered are stamped with geometric patterns, cloud scrolls, and the faces of animals. Each one a small piece of an aesthetic world that has largely vanished. When scholars hold one of those tiles today, they are holding the edge of something much larger that they cannot fully see. The interior life of the Chu court at Ying, situated near modern-day Jingzhou in Hubei province along the Jianghan Plain, was unlike anything in the northern kingdoms. And this difference was not superficial. Chu was a civilization with its own religious tradition, one that the northern states viewed with a mixture of fascination and suspicion. Where the courts of Qi and Zhao organized their rituals around the ancestor veneration and cosmic orderliness codified in the Book of Rites, the Chu palace was saturated with a different spiritual atmosphere altogether. Chu religious life centered on the Wu, ritual specialists who moved between the human and spirit worlds through music, dance, and trance. And this shaped not only the ceremonies performed in the palace, but the aesthetic world that surrounded those ceremonies at every moment. The Chu court's lacquerware tells this story better than any text can. Specimens recovered from Chu-era tombs in the region, many of them buried to accompany nobles and court officials, are among the most visually arresting objects to survive from the ancient world. The lacquer ground is typically a deep, almost luminous black, and against it the artisans of Ying and its surrounding workshops painted serpents that transform into birds mid-body, tigers with bared teeth dissolving into swirling cloud patterns, antlered deer, whose forms become indistinguishable from the vegetation around them. These are not decorative motifs in any simple sense. They are images from a universe that believed in genuine transformation between forms. A tiger could become a spirit. A cloud could become an ancestor. A dancer moving correctly could move between worlds. The objects used at the Chu court were, in this sense, already saturated with spiritual significance before any ceremony had begun. Inside the Ying Palace itself, the spatial arrangement reflected these concerns. The great ritual halls faced south, as in all the kingdoms, but the inner chambers of the Chu palace were spaces where the Wu performed their invocations to a pantheon that the northern scholars regarded as dangerously unorthodox. The poet Ku Yuan, who served at the Chu court in the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, left in his surviving works vivid descriptions of ritual music filling the palace halls, drums and bronze bells sounding together, dancers in elaborate costumes moving through choreographed sequences that enacted the descent of spirits into the mortal world. The walls of the Chu ceremonial halls were hung with silk, and the silk itself was painted, not with the geometric propriety favored further north, but with images from Chu mythology, the great cosmological figures whose names appear in the 9 songs: the River Earl, the Mountain Spirit, the Lord of the Clouds. This was a palace that believed the gods might actually arrive. The rituals were not commemorative. They were invitations. What strikes scholars who study the material evidence of these courts is how different the experience of luxury was across the 7 kingdoms, and how each kingdom's palace world expressed a particular theory of power. At Shenyang in Shanxi province, the palace of the state of Qin stood on its rammed earth platform northwest of the Wei River, and its interior, as revealed by archaeology, was in some respects the most utilitarian of the 7 great palaces, and in other respects, the most forward-thinking. Excavations at the Xianyang Palace site, designated a protected historical site by the Chinese State Council in 1988, have uncovered 3 major palace structure sites from the Warring States period alone, before Qin had yet unified the country. The first of these major structures measured 177 meters east to west and 45 meters north to south, built on a platform rising 6 meters above the surrounding ground. The structure had 2 functional levels. The upper floor contained the main audience hall, while the lower floor and surrounding areas held sleeping chambers, toilets, and bathrooms. There were charcoal stoves built into the rooms for heating in winter. Ceramic pipes ran beneath the floors to carry wastewater away, and on one of the palace walls, partially recovered in fragments, now recognized as the oldest surviving palace mural in China, were painted images of carriages, horses, people in motion, pavilions, and plants. This was not a palace decorated with mythology. It was decorated with life, with the organized, documented, administered world of a state that believed power came from rational management rather than divine favor. The contrast with Chu could not be more complete, and it is perhaps not entirely coincidental that it was Qin, with its rational, documented material approach to power, that eventually swallowed all the others. The palace guards at any of these courts occupied a strange position in the social world of their kingdom. Their role was simultaneously one of the most visible and one of the most invisible in palace life. They stood at thresholds. They watched transitions. They knew the geography of the palace as no one else did. Which doors were locked at which hours, which corridors were used for official processions and which for the movement of servants carrying food and water. Which rooms held the bronze ritual vessels during the seasons when they were not in use. And they knew the rhythms of the court as only people who are present but presumed invisible can know them. Which ministers spent too long in private audience with the king? Which servants came and went from the inner apartments at unusual hours? Which messengers arrived at night? Inside the audience halls of Handan, Linzi, and Ying, the daily business of governance was conducted through a system of rituals that themselves constituted a form of political communication. When a minister entered the audience hall, the speed and depth of his bow communicated his rank and his current standing. When the king received a gift from a foreign state, the materials of the gift, its lacquer, its bronze, its silk, the specific animals represented in its decoration, communicated the diplomatic intentions of the sender more precisely than any accompanying words. The warring states' courts were saturated with a visual language so complex that the advisors responsible for interpreting it were themselves a specialized professional class. A Chu lacquer vessel showing a particular mythological pairing did not just mean Chu was sending a valuable object. It meant something specific about how Chu was positioning itself in the current diplomatic moment, and the Qi court officials who received and unpacked it would spend time debating what exactly was being communicated. None of this knowledge was written down in plain language. It was held in living minds, transmitted through apprenticeship, and lost when the courts themselves were destroyed. The royal kitchens of the warring states' palaces were places of extraordinary complexity and considerable danger. Feeding a king was not simply a logistical problem. It was a ritual one. The king's diet was governed by prescriptions from texts that specified which foods were appropriate to which seasons, which preparations were correct for which ritual occasions, and which combinations were forbidden. Grain steamed in particular vessels, meat roasted over fires built with specific kinds of wood, soups prepared with fermented paste that had aged for months. These were not simply foods. They were statements about the king's relationship with the natural order. Getting it wrong was not a culinary failure. It was a ritual failure, with consequences that extended beyond the kitchen into the cosmos. The bronze vessels used in royal kitchens and ceremonial halls are among the best documented objects from this period, precisely because they were considered valuable enough to bury with the dead. The ding, a round or rectangular cooking vessel on legs, often enormous, was the most symbolically charged object in any palace. Controlling the ding meant controlling the kingdom's ritual life. When a state was conquered and its palace destroyed, the conquerors took the ding. When the Zhou royal house lost its political authority, what people noticed and discussed was that the Zhou ding had become vulnerable to seizure. The phrase asking about the weight of the ding became a way of asking whether a ruler was strong enough to hold what he had. Inside the workshops attached to the palace compounds, craftsmen produced objects of technical sophistication that still astonishes modern analysts. The bronze casting workshops of the warring states' kingdoms were producing alloys tuned to specific acoustic properties. The bells buried with the Marquis Yi of Zheng at his tomb in Suizhou, Hubei province, required such precise control over the copper-tin-lead ratios in each individual bell that researchers in the 20th century struggled to replicate the results using modern analytical chemistry. The set of 65 bells recovered from that tomb, cast around 433 BCE, could produce 2 different tones per bell depending on where they were struck, covering a range of 5 octaves. They were not decorative objects. They were precision instruments, and the workshops that produced them were staffed by specialists whose knowledge was accumulated over generations and jealously guarded. What happened to those specialists when a kingdom fell is one of the sadder questions in the history of the ancient world. Many were taken as captives to the conquering state. Their skills were too valuable to destroy, but transplanted from the workshop traditions they had learned within. Separated from the materials suppliers and the networks of knowledge that had shaped their techniques, they often found themselves unable to produce what they had produced before. The knowledge was not just in their hands. It was in the specific clay of a particular riverbank used for molds, in the charcoal sourced from a particular type of wood, in the relationships between different specialists in a workshop that had evolved over decades. When you scattered those people, you scattered the knowledge with them. The sleeping quarters of the warring states' kings were places where the boundary between private life and political life dissolved entirely. A king who slept poorly was a king whose court would know it by morning, not from any announcement, but from the subtle shifts in the behavior of the inner servants, the timing of the morning audiences, the edge in the king's voice when he received the first reports of the day. The inner apartments of the palace were staffed by a hierarchy of attendants whose entire professional existence was organized around the body and the sleep of the ruler. They managed the temperature of the rooms, charcoal stoves in winter, natural ventilation systems built into the architecture in summer. They managed the lighting, ceramic oil lamps, the good oil reserved for the inner chambers, a dimmer grade for the outer halls. They managed the sound, because palaces in this period were far noisier than any modern notion of regal silence would suggest. The constant movement of people, the clang of bronze tools in the kitchen corridors, the sound of water moving through the drainage channels beneath the floor. The drainage technology of the warring states' palaces is itself a history that almost no one tells. Archaeologists excavating the sites at Handan, Linxi, and Jianyang have found elaborate ceramic pipe systems running beneath the floors and through the walls of the palace structures, designed to carry water from bathing areas, kitchens, and latrines away from the occupied zones of the compound. The pipe segments were manufactured in standardized sizes, so that they could be joined together in runs of whatever length the specific architectural situation required. This was not improvised engineering. It was systematic infrastructure, planned at the design stage and built in parallel with the structures above it. In winter, when the ground froze, these systems required active management to prevent damage. There were people in the palace workforce whose specific job was the maintenance of underground pipe systems. People who spent their working lives in trenches and crawl spaces beneath the floors of halls where kings received ambassadors. Those people are not in the histories. But without them, the palaces could not have functioned for a week. The political life of the warring states' courts was characterized by an intellectual ferment that found its physical home in the palace and its immediate surroundings. The Jixia Academy at Lindsay, established in the southwestern corner of the Qi Palace district around 360 BCE under King Wei of Qi, was a deliberate institutional experiment. The first time any ruler had organized systematic patronage of scholars and philosophers as a strategy of state power. At its height, the academy housed several hundred scholars who lived, argued, and published under royal protection. Philosophers from every school, Confucians, Taoists, Mohists, legalists, specialists in military strategy, specialists in diplomatic technique, lived and debated within walking distance of the palace gate. The king did not necessarily adopt their conclusions, but having them there demonstrated to every visiting diplomat and rival ruler that Qi was a kingdom of ideas, a place where intelligence was valued as a resource alongside grain and bronze. This innovation was enormously consequential, and it was not replicated identically anywhere else. The state of Wei had its own tradition of scholar patronage, but organized differently, around individual ministers rather than a collective institution. The state of Qin notoriously imported scholars from other kingdoms and used them ruthlessly for specific administrative purposes without providing the kind of open intellectual environment Qi offered. The differences in how each kingdom organized knowledge work reflected deeper differences in their theories of governance. And those differences showed up in the physical organization of the palace itself, where scholars were housed, which halls they could access, whether their debates were treated as private intellectual exercises or as political instruments. When Qin began its systematic conquest of the other kingdoms, Han fell in 230 BCE, Zhao in 228 BCE, Wei in 225 BCE, Chu in 223 BCE, Yan in 222 BCE, Qi in 221 BCE. The physical destruction of the palace compounds was among the first acts of conquest in each case. Not because the buildings were military targets, but because the palace was the symbolic center of the kingdom's existence. Destroying it was not just destroying architecture, it was destroying the ritual infrastructure of a civilization. In the case of Zhao, the fall of Handan in 228 BCE ended a palace tradition that had operated continuously for a century and a half. The ritual vessels that had been used in the Zhao court ceremonies were seized. The craftsmen who had maintained the palace workshops were taken west. The musicians who had performed in the audience halls, specialists in Zhao's particular regional musical tradition, which was distinct from the music played at the Qi or Chu courts, were dispersed. The bronzes and lacquerware that had filled the storerooms were inventoried and incorporated into Qin's accumulation of the material culture of the conquered world. What happened next is documented in the historical records, and it is one of the stranger acts in the history of power. Xin Shi Huang, after completing the conquest of all 6 rivals, ordered that replicas of each conquered kingdom's palace be built in the capital region around Shenyang in Shanxi province. Every time a kingdom fell, its palace was architecturally recreated within reach of the Qin capital. The sources describe more than 270 palace structures built within a radius of 200 li of Xianyang, connected by elevated walkways and covered corridors, so that the emperor could walk through miniature versions of all the worlds he had consumed. He could stand in what had been Zhao and see a hall decorated in the Zhao manner. He could walk to what had been Chu and hear music played in the Chu style, if there were still musicians alive who knew it. This is a breathtaking act of cultural absorption that looks, from one angle, like preservation, and from another angle, like total annihilation. The actual palaces of the conquered kingdoms were gone. What remained were replicas, maintained for the emperor's pleasure, staffed by captive specialists who were performing their own culture for a foreign ruler who had decided that culture was now his property. The difference between a living tradition and a performance of that tradition for an audience that owns you is a difference so profound that it has no adequate name. The Xianyang Palace complex burned in 206 BCE, 15 years after the first emperor died. The general Xiang Yu, commanding the forces that brought down the short-lived Qin dynasty, set fire to the palace, and contemporary accounts say the fire burned for 3 months. Everything inside, the murals painted by the craftsmen of Qin, the replicated halls of the 6 conquered kingdoms, the bronze vessels accumulated over a century of conquest, the lacquerware and the silk and the ceramic water pipes and the charcoal stoves and the sleeping chambers and the audience halls and the weapon storerooms and the kitchens. All of it was ash. A fire that burns for 3 months is not a fire that destroys a building. It is a fire that destroys a library. The ruins that exist today at Xianyang, at Handan, at the Linzi site in Shandong, these are not simply the ruins of palaces. They are the ruins of entire ways of being in the world. When you stand on the rammed earth platform at Handan, now just a raised mound covered in grass, you are standing on what was once the highest point in a capital city of 400,000 people. The place from which Zhao kings looked south toward the plains that their state controlled, and north toward the mountains that defined their border with the steppe. When you walk the edge of the ancient Linzi enclosure wall, you are walking the boundary between the ordinary city and the royal world that existed inside it. A world of such complexity and specialization that several hundred people were required simply to maintain the infrastructure that allowed a few dozen people to govern. These places were not exceptional in the way we tend to imagine exceptional things. They were exceptional in the way that a finely tuned system is exceptional. Not because it is ornate, but because every part of it works with every other part. And the removal of any component causes a cascade of effects that can't be fully anticipated. What made the warring states' palaces extraordinary was not their gold, of which there was remarkably little compared to later imperial periods. It was their knowledge, the accumulated expertise of craftsmen, musicians, ritual specialists, diplomatic interpreters, kitchen managers, drainage engineers, and court historians who had spent lifetimes learning their specific piece of a vast interlocking system. When Qin extinguished the last of those kingdoms, it extinguished most of that knowledge with them. What it replaced them with was, in its own terms, magnificent. A unified empire with standardized writing, standardized weights, standardized axle widths, standardized law. A world in which everyone was using the same system. But the price of that standardization was the loss of everything that had not been standardized. The Chu court's particular form of spiritual practice, the Zhao metalworking tradition, the Qi school of diplomatic interpretation, the Wei system of agricultural administration. These were not primitive precursors to something better. They were fully developed answers to fully developed problems, and they were gone. History tends to record what empires build. It rarely records what they replace. The people who lived and worked in those lost palaces, the guards at the Handan Gate, the musicians of the Ying court, the tile painters of Linzi, the drainage engineers of Xianyang, did not know they were living through the end of a world. That is never how it feels from inside. What they knew was the particular rhythm of their day, when the king's chamber required heating, when the ceremonial vessels needed polishing, when the academy opened its debates, when the river gates of the palace drainage system required inspection before the spring rains came. Their world was the texture of daily life in a place that was also, unmistakably, a center of power. It was both ordinary and extraordinary at the same moment, in the way that all life is, for the people actually living it. The palaces are gone, but the earth that held them is still there, and underneath it, in the layers that archaeologists work through 1 centimeter at a time, are the fragments that tell us these worlds were real. That they were full of color and sound and expertise and ambition and fear and beauty, and the 10,000 ordinary things that hold a civilization together from the inside. What happens when you find something that has been lost so long that no one remembered it was missing? That is the question archaeology keeps asking, and the lost palaces of China's 7 kingdoms keep answering it, one tile fragment at a time.